Hello, everybody who is out there. I can see some people are starting to join us. I hope you can see me, and I hope you can hear me, most importantly. Now we're just going to settle ourselves, give it another couple of minutes for everybody to log in, get themselves sorted. But just let me just see. So there's the chat is there. You can put some comments in the chat, and also there's a Q&A box as well for people to use, and we'll try and get through as many of the questions and the big themes that you guys want to raise. So we'll just give it a couple of minutes while everybody settles. Sometimes it takes a while for everybody to get into the system. And for social media action, the hashtag that we've been using for these discussions is hashtag Corona Conversations, and that's like a big C and a big C. Big C for Corona, big C for conversations. And yeah, please do tweet about it. It's good for people to know, what we're discussing, and to create a bit of a buzz about it. And as I say, there is the chat room function, so please do put some stuff in there. But it's really important to just get on record that this is a kind of safe space for everybody. We have a very strict zero tolerance policy about abuse or slagging anybody off, and the chat will be monitored, and anybody who abuses it will be ejected from the event. If you want to slag someone off, you can come and do that on Twitter to me afterwards. I'm used to that. It's kind of like my job in life. You can just direct it all at me. I'll be the sort of vector for all the abuse. And so we've got some people coming. We've got hello B from London. B has arrived. Hello Karen from the Manchester Feminist Network. Great to have you with us. I think that's one of the really nice things we were just saying as we were just about to get started, that the one good thing about lockdown is that these webinars are brilliant for just creating so much more engagement. So many people. We got lots of Poole Dorset, Manuela from East London, Sarah from Tenderden, Victoria, councillor from Rotherham, Shirley from sunny Glasgow. Is it sunny in Glasgow, Shirley? Is it? Debbie from Newark, North London, Milton Keynes, Birmingham, Bexley Heath, Manchester, Scottish Borders, sunny in the Scottish Borders. I feel like it's Eurovision. I've got it's great. I feel like it's it's great. Cambridge, Southwest London, Hackney. Everyone seems to be sunny, which is really. Bury, Preston, but living in, but originally from Spain. Raynham, Brighton, Norfolk, very sunny in North Norfolk. Rory from Woking, hello. Sunny in Leeds as well. God, is it sunny in hiding? Is there anywhere? Is anybody anywhere where it's not sunny? Like a sunny Hove. It's always nice and sunny in Hove. Hertfordshire. Berwick upon Tweed, Poole, Jill, hello Linda, Berwick upon Tweed. This is excellent. We've got so many people from all over the place. Hello, Sissy from Newcastle University Business School, sunny there too, brilliant. We've got about 150 people now on the thing, which is great. Just see if we're ready to start properly. Fawcett Birmingham is here, Marcia from London. Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, I think we will get cracking. So for those of you who just come on, welcome, and thank you so much for giving up a very, very sunny evening, as all our participants are telling us, and joining us for what is a really, really important and I think very timely discussion as well. I'm Ayesha Hazarika. I'll be your host for this event. I'm a former Labour advisor, and I'm now a political commentator and a broadcaster and a journalist. And I'm also a trustee of the Fawcett Society. And I'm delighted to be doing this project and chairing this event. I think it really couldn't have come at a more useful time, because the big discussion that's raging at the moment is how people are feeling as we move to the next stage of this corona crisis. And, you know, we have all had the pain of being in lockdown, but now it feels like there's actually quite a lot of pain and anxiety about the next stage, which is coming out of lockdown. And how does the government do that in a way which gives people confidence? But particularly, what is the female take on all of this? And we know that men have been very, very affected from a health point of view, and that is a very important thing to note on the record, and particularly you know, sort of working class men. But I think it's fair to say women, that doesn't mean that there's not a huge toll on women, and women are telling us, we know this anecdotally, and we have the evidence here to back it up, which we're going to hear about. Women are feeling like this virus and this crisis has really taken a big toll on them personally, in terms of the domestic load, in terms of their jobs being under threat, in terms of caring responsibilities. They're obviously cooped up looking after, you know, young children, possibly older children, but they're also very, very worried about their parents as well. There's lots of women right now facing a really nightmare sandwich generation challenge, which is difficult enough at the best of times, but how do you navigate this now in this very difficult situation? And a lot of women are really anxious about the next stage as well. You know, the research, and we'll talk about this, lots of women are just feeling anxious about how quickly things will go back to being normal, and what does normal mean, for example, going back to schools and that kind of thing. So we're going to have a really interesting discussion about all of this. We've got some fantastic new research that Fawcett has done with Ipsos MORI, and we've got an illustrious panel of real experts to talk to us about their kind of views on things. And like I say, we'll have a discussion with you guys afterwards. Now, I'm just going to take you through our panelists to begin with. So we're going to just hear from like each of them to begin with. And we've got, I'll just take you through who they are all individually. We've got Kully Kaur-Ballagan, and she is the research director at Ipsos MORI, and she's been there for since 1999. She's a very, very experienced social researcher, particularly research amongst those kind of hard to reach communities. And she's really been sort of leading on this piece of research. So we're very lucky to have her here today, and she's going to take us through all of this. We have Deborah Mattinson, who's the founding director of Britianthinks, which is a research agency that really puts you know, the people that matter at the heart of its clients, and they've become a real leading force in terms of social commentary and how the British political and social landscape is changing. And Deborah is a very, very well established pollster, was famously a pollster for the Labour Party for Gordon Brown, and in 2010 she published a book talking to the brick wall, and she's now working on a book about the Red Wall 10 years later, the seismic change that happened at the last general election. So we're delighted to have Deborah here. We have Jennifer Williams. Jennifer Williams is basically one of the best journalists in the country right now. She really, really is. She's brilliant. She's an absolute kind of legend, so well respected amongst journalistic circles. One of the, not just regional journalists, just one of the best journalists, a political editor of the Manchester Evening News. If you don't follow Jennifer on Twitter, please do, because she breaks incredible news stories that then get followed up all around the rest of the country. And she's going to talk to us about her take from the Manchester Evening News, which is of course a huge pioneering newspaper in that region, and they themselves have actually done quite a lot of work looking into these attitudes. She's going to take us through that. And we've got Gemma Rosenblatt, who's head of policy and campaigns at the Fawcett Society, and the Fawcett Society has been doing a lot of work around the issue of lockdown and women in lockdown, and Gemma's going to be talking to us a bit about, and they've done this stuff called lockdown diaries, trying to capture sort of how women are feeling, the whole kind of sensory, the full experience of what it's like being a woman in lockdown, and looking ahead to the next stage. So without any further ado, I'll just remind you quickly, the hashtag is hashtag Corona Conversations, big C for Corona, big C for conversations. So Kully, could I ask you to begin and just take us through this brilliant bit of research that you've done for us?
Great, yes, thank you, Ayesha. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah. Hopefully everyone can see that. Great. Yeah, I'm just going to talk through some new analysis we've done on our polling data for the Fawcett Society, looking specifically at how attitudes towards coronavirus differ by gender. I'm just going to do a snapshot of some of the key points. The full analysis is on both the Fawcett Society website and our website. This is just to sort of get us thinking for this evening. Now, as Ayesha has already mentioned, we know that men are more at risk of COVID-19. However, women are more concerned than men. We asked people, and I know a number of people are looking at, different demographic groups. We asked people, which of these groups are more likely to be affected by COVID-19? And it's a bit of a messy chart, but I just want you to look at the bottom bar. Around 1 in 4, this is of the entire population, say that men are more likely to be affected than women. It's about 1 in 10 for women, although half say it's the same now. And this is no different when you look at the genders in terms of who's affected. And also we can look at things like ethnic minorities, as you've mentioned, poorer people. But when we ask people, how concerned are you about the risk of COVID-19 to yourselves? Actually, there's no difference between men and women on that measure. But when we ask, how concerned are you about the risk that coronavirus poses to the country as a whole, there's actually quite a big difference, around half of women saying they're very concerned and around about a third of men. And one of the things we're going to look at is sort of the mental health. Now, 6 in 10 women say they're finding it harder to stay positive day to day compared to around half of men. And the gap was slightly wider at the beginning of lockdown, but it hasn't really moved much. So women throughout lockdown have felt much more, found it more difficult to stay positive. And women are much more concerned about the economic impact. So just as we entered lockdown, in February, around 4 in 10 people across the board were worried about saying that the economy is going to get worse. Now this amongst women has shot up to 3/4. So now 77% of women think the economy is going to get worse. So while they're more concerned, it hasn't really stopped them doing things during lockdown. So, in terms of coping strategies and things that they've been doing, across a range of measures, women have actually been more kind of active in terms of keeping in touch with friends and family, helping out in the community, helping vulnerable neighbours or, those who might be lonely, as well as a range of activities in the home. So interestingly, across all these things we asked for, the only areas where there aren't any gender differences tend to be gardening, decorating the house and baking bread. Everyone seems to be baking sourdough bread. And looking to the future, as we are beginning to see the easing of lockdown, what does this mean? Well, across a range of measures, women are much more anxious about returning to normal. They feel much more uncomfortable around things like going out to public gatherings, using public transport, sending children to school. And actually today we've just released some new data on this, and the gender differences are still there, and in some cases have actually become greater, for example, around sending children back to school. And I think one of the questions, and I'm sure we'll discuss this, about what does this mean in terms of return to work? So we know in the data, you can see in sort of full set, but that more women are saying that their workplace is closed or changed as a result of coronavirus. And now, given that women are everyone's feeling anxious about returning to work, this was pre-lockdown. People were saying that women's careers were much more likely to be damaged from working at home than men's. Now, given that more people are working from home, it will be interesting to see if the impact of coronavirus exacerbates these inequalities, or will it actually change some attitudes? Thank you.
Because I think have I been unmuted? Yeah, if you've got the time, do have a look through that research, because it's really interesting, some of the sort of layers in it. One of the things that I thought was fascinating looking through it is that women have been more likely to adhere to the social distancing rules. Women are more likely to have stayed in the house more than men, which maybe explains why they're more anxious about returning. And just a few comments that are coming in from people. Jen has made a very important point, saying don't forget about older women. Many older women are like stuck at home, and they might actually be stuck at home for a lot longer than the rest of us, and obviously missing families. And someone else has made the point that maybe women are expressing their anxieties because they're more prepared to talk about it. Men a bit of a sort of stiff upper lip, not so free to kind of talk about their sort of anxieties. Deborah, I'm going to come to you next, and if you could just take us through your thoughts. And one of the things that I'm quite interested in is do women voters view the government's handling in a sort of different way, do you think? Like, one of the criticisms has been that the corona crisis handling, the optics, the Downing Street press conferences, the corona sort of key group of politicians have been quite male dominated. Do you think women voters will respond to this in a different way?
Oh, yes, you can
Yes.
hear me now. Great. I think we're just starting to see that. It's a really interesting phenomenon. So actually, I spent a lot of time looking at the gender gap in voting over many, many years. There have been times when it's been huge, and there have been times where there hasn't really been one. And the last few years has been characteristic of there not being much of a gender gap. And I think we're just starting to see that coming back, which is quite interesting. I mean, the other thing I think that is coming back, frankly, is politics at all. Because one of the really striking things about this period has been that there's been this sort of remarkable unity initially with people. Everybody says rallying around the flag. Actually, I don't think they were rallying around the flag. I think they were actually rallying around the NHS. And that's a different story, which we can explore, but very important. And we've seen just in the last few weeks that starting to break down and starting to change. And women, particularly, looking at Boris Johnson and being rather sceptical about what he's doing. So, perhaps we can come back to that. Well, I just wanted to pick up on a few points, if I may, Ayesha. Following on really from what Kully said, and I try not to repeat what she said, the work that we do at Britianthinks is qualitative, more deep dive, so focus groups. We've been running a diary series as well, which we're now in our 7th week of. We call it the Coronavirus Diaries, as you can imagine. And what we're doing, we have 50 people all around the country keeping diaries for us every week. And so I'm drawing a little bit on that, but absolutely echoing the themes that Kully has set out. So women are not coping as well as men, and say they're not. So a third of women versus a quarter of men say that they're not coping. And we find younger women particularly, we find that women are really struggling with some of the situation they find themselves in with lockdown. This is particularly true for women with children, and even more true for single parents. And just a couple of quotes. We had a woman called Emma from Birmingham, who's one of our diaries. She's got 2 children under 5. And this week she wrote, "I'm really lonely, and frankly, the kids are driving me crazy, but I'm trying to put a brave face on it for the kids." Then we had Angela from Glasgow, another single mum with 2 kids, 12 and 4. She has asthma, so she's trying not to go out. And she hates being reliant on neighbours and having to ask people to help her, but she has to do that. She has no money because her job has finished, and she said it's really difficult because she's having to ask people to go shopping, and then she's having to say to them, don't try and find the cheapest rice and try and find the cheapest tin of tomatoes. It's very, very difficult. And women are harder hit financially, as we know. A survey that the RSA did found that women were more anxious about finances and more likely to feel it was having a direct and negative impact on their mental health. It's Mental Health Week this week, and I think it's this is something that's really coming to the fore as a result of lockdown. Women are more likely to be working in low paid and precarious sectors like caring and retail, and they're more concerned also that they might lose their homes. So 1 in 5 women is worried that they're going to actually become homeless as a result of that. And even the better off who are working from home, and it is on the whole the better off women who are working from home, are worried about how that's going to impact their career. One of our diaries said, this is going to really have an impact on women like me, very negatively. We've had to take on all the childcare. We're having to do all the domestic responsibilities. We're doing all the cleaning while our husbands are sort of sitting upstairs doing their work. So, there are some real tensions, I think, in people's families coming through. Women are more fearful of the lockdown, more likely to be nervous about it ending, and less likely to break the rules than men. And I think that's really interesting. You know, Kully has talked about the numbers here, but anecdotally, our women diarists were talking, they really feel that they're taking the hit for the whole family, for their kids. They're worried about the kids going back to school, but they're also really worried about elderly relatives. And we found that 69% of women said if lockdown lifted further, they'd still be scared to go out. They still don't want to go out, whereas only 56% of men say that. One woman wrote in her diary this week, there's so much to worry about. Quite frankly, I'm really trying hard not to think about it now. And what we find is that women in particular are windowing news stories. So initially people were watching everything and hoovering it all up. Now they're really trying to ration themselves. And instead they're watching comedy and rom-coms. They're trying to, you know, watch things that will lift them out of all of the gloom. And women, as Kully said, are more likely to be supporting other people, and they're more likely to reach out for support too, which is quite interesting. When we asked what they missed most, our diarists told us, women said that they really miss family and friends and hugging them and that kind of physical contact, whereas men said they miss sport and the pub. So very, very different agendas. Women really crave that contact, and they're trying to recreate it by using Zoom and having long phone calls, whereas men are much more likely to use sort of distant methods of keeping in touch, like text messaging and so on. And then just the final thing I wanted to say is about the future, because I think we're increasingly finding that our diarists are becoming really focused, not so much on what's happening now, but what's going to happen next. And here there's some optimism, actually. Some of them really do think that this might change the way we live for the better. I should say, I was doing one of these sessions actually with a group of sort of business people this morning, and they were talking about how gloomy the economic outcomes were looking to be. And I feel that a lot of the ordinary members of the public have not clocked that at all. They're not really thinking about that at the moment. So this thing is coming down the track, and it's hard to know how they're going to react. So at the moment, people are hoping that things might change for the better. And we found only 9% said they wanted us to go back to normal, and 47% think that we're going to emerge from this better. We're going to value carers more, we're going to value other key workers more, we're going to be sharing parenting more, and that it's going to change men too. And one of our women diaries said, honestly, the worst outcome from all of this is that we don't learn anything and life goes back to normal because we don't want that. So it's got a quick heads up there. I mean, echoing, I think, lots of Kully's themes, but maybe some things that we can pick through a little bit more as the discussion unfolds.
Thanks, Deborah. And I think the themes that both Deborah and Kully have gone through, it's really striking a chord with you guys listening. I'm seeing a lot of people putting comments in saying, you know, your point towards the end, Deborah, about, and someone actually raised this beforehand, possibly women are better at talking about this stuff. Like, I think men are finding it quite difficult because, you know, I think everyone's anxiety levels are quite high. Victoria messaged in to say your point about if you're shielding and you have to get people to shop for you. She said in Swindon she's picked up that some people are embarrassed because they can't afford things, and that makes you feel
they would say that to their neighbour. Yeah,
you don't want to kind of reveal all of that. So very kind of personal things. People have raised also about testing, and the fact that like so many women work in the care sector, and they're very worried as well about the testing or lack of testing and how you get tested. And Jackie actually has just raised an interesting question, which I'll pause now. Actually, I'll just come put this to you very quickly now, Deborah, because it's a really interesting question. Jackie has said, given that the general election is swung by a relatively small number of seats and a small number of voters, what kind of specific gender research has been done on these particular seats, these kind of key swing seats, although the swing seats are kind of changing?
I don't know if she's thinking particularly here about the Red Wall, which is where I've just spent, you know, quite a lot. I mean, right up until lockdown, I've been doing sort of focus groups and ethnographic interviews where you go into people's homes and you kind of hang out with them for a bit. And I've done that equally with men and women. What I have found, and this is, you know, it's a bit of a generalization, but women actually, if anything, were more gung-ho about the change and the choice that they'd made in switching. I tended to focus on people who'd been lifelong Labour voters, who had voted Conservative often for the first time in 2019. I found that women were very, very positive, particularly about Boris Johnson. This is sort of in the run up to the election and immediately, and afterwards, of course, they're very much justifying their choice. Of course they are, because they've made a big decision. And, you know, if we had much longer than we have tonight, I could tell you all the things that lie behind that. But it is quite interesting. And it's something I think that Boris Johnson's going to be looking at very carefully. And I'm sure Keir Starmer will as well, because I think the women's vote is going to be very important in those key seats.
Yeah, the women's vote is very important, and politicians often take them for granted right until the last minute, when suddenly there's this great hunt for the female vote without actually asking women voters, what do you really, really want? Thanks so much for all your comments. Please do keep them coming in. It's really like energizing for us. It's really useful for us. Julie saying that everything that she's heard is really resonating with her own experience. Liz, I think a voice of reason here, actually says she hopes things will change, but she's not that convinced if change will actually happen. Yeah. And I think that is a very, very important point, Liz. Like right now, like I think we are all very much like, this is a moment, everything's going to change. But remember, after the global financial crisis, we all said we want things to change, and nothing really did change. It did go back to business as usual. Let's hope that doesn't happen, but you're right, we should kind of flag that. So I now I just also wanted to say, somebody also had just put, and I think it's really important, we're talking a lot about women with children and grandchildren. There's a lot of single women as well, and somebody has made a very important point that single women, you know, and I'm a single woman as I live with myself, it's very lonely, and loneliness is a huge issue as well. This is another thing. We talked a bit about loneliness in the past. Tracy Crouch was appointed as the Minister for Loneliness, but like we're now seeing that loneliness is a really, really important kind of thing in terms of mental health and well-being.
It's a big factor. The question we asked about how well are you coping, and single people and younger, often correlating with being a bit younger, with the people who were struggling most, that was up to 42% of younger people saying that they weren't coping.
Yeah, and actually, Marcy has also made a point saying that, look, you know, look, we shouldn't underestimate as many young people are actually considering suicide. You know, it's a very, 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 very tough time that we can't sort of, you know, that it's incredibly serious. Now, I'd like to move on to Jen, and Jen, you're going to give us a sort of a view from, obviously from a media point of view, from a Manchester point of view, from your paper's point of view, but I'd also quite like to kind of get a sense from you how you think the government has been handling this crisis, because I think that it's been very interesting watching the sort of approval numbers. They were pretty solid for quite a long time, and then they seem to have gone down recently, and there's been quite an interesting, it's been quite a tense relationship between the government and Number 10 and journalists. And there's actually been quite a tense relationship between journalists and the public over this as well. Many of the public have sort of felt that actually journalists have been giving the government a bit too hard a time. Oddly enough, Piers Morgan has emerged as a sort of, weirdly, very much, championing taking the government to task, but he's had a backlash. So it'd be great just to hear, as well as what you've got to say, just a few, your views on all of that stuff, because you yourself have been at the sharp end of this as well.
Yeah, so I think I think the issue around gender sits in my mind alongside a lot of the other stuff that's going on beneath the surface in terms of some of the nuances about how the virus has been playing out, and also probably how the economic impact will play out further down the line. So to some extent, I guess, necessarily in the early days of this, everything coming from politicians, and also in many respects, a lot of what was coming from the media and the narrative was very uniform. So it was very, all the headlines was, what was the global total every day for the number of people who had died or the number of cases right across the country, and there wasn't much breakdown of that. So you couldn't initially, you couldn't even distinguish, in fact, between care homes and hospital settings, but you couldn't distinguish between the numbers, or very clearly between the prevalence in different regions, and also you didn't get the sense of how that was playing out in terms of deprivation or gender. And I think as we're sort of going along and the data is getting better, and the reality, I guess, of how the virus is playing out on a kind of health basis, because obviously there's a BAME issue with the way that it's playing out, but also deprivation as well. And you've heard politicians like Andy Burnham talking in the last couple of weeks about the disproportionate regional variations. And as you've seen Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland come out and go in a different direction to the UK government, you're starting to get the sense that it isn't such a uniform picture, and it is a much more complex story, and that also goes for women's responses to it as well. So that's my sort of feeling about where things have been sort of moving, and I completely agree with you that I think political consensus, or Deborah, political consensus has been fracturing, particularly over the last couple of weeks or so. I've noticed politicians who kind of hitherto had been pretty consensual about working with the government and quite kind of collegiate, now coming out and sort of taking a stand. And I suppose part of that is that it is always going to be more politically difficult taking us out of this than it was sending us into it, especially anything where parents and children are concerned. I think so. We did our company has got titles all over the UK and also in Ireland as well, and we did a big poll about 3 weeks ago. So we're perhaps a little bit more out of date on some of the stuff that you've been talking about. And it's not, you know, it's self-selecting and all the usual caveats, but it was a big sample. There was about 400,000 people in it, and there was a couple of things I found interesting about it, and I can talk a little bit about the what we found on gender, which is very similar to what we've talked about already, especially where mental health was concerned, and also the distinction between white women and BAME women, and their experience is quite pronounced in some respects. But the regional variations were interesting. So, and they didn't really go necessarily along party political lines. They looked to me as though they correlated a little bit more with Brexit. So the kind of Remainy cities, regardless of what part of the country that might be, so your Manchester, Bristol, but then also Scotland, would be much more inclined to be critical of the government about when the lockdown was brought in, and give much lower approval ratings to Boris Johnson personally. And from off the top of my head, I think Grimsby gave Boris Johnson the best personal rating, and I think Glasgow and Liverpool gave the worst. And I mean, obviously Liverpool's perhaps a special example in all of that. But that was what jumped out at me, that it seemed to more mirror almost the red wall politics that we've talked about over the last kind of year or so than your typically kind of like left-right worldview. I think on gender, as I say, a lot of what we found mirrored what's already been talked about. We found women much more concerned about the overall situation than men. So 61% of women currently very concerned about the overall situation compared to 47% men. But also on social distancing, women were much more likely to think that it'd been introduced too late, and that rises significantly among Black and Asian women. So 63% of men thought that they'd been brought in too late, and that was a broad picture. I think pretty much across the board, the majority of people, however which way you sliced it, most people thought that they'd been brought in too late. But for men, that was about 63%. That rose to 82% among women from Indian, Pakistani or Bangladeshi backgrounds. And where we talked a little bit, women are also more pessimistic in terms of how long they think this will last. They think that social distancing, far more likely to think that social distancing will continue for 6 months or longer. And then certainly on mental health, 58% of women said they'd experienced more anxiety compared to 36% of men, and similar differences where loneliness and depression were concerned. So very much kind of what we've been talking about. And then kind of interesting differences in terms of people's actual personal experiences of home life. Women more likely to say that homeschooling is difficult. Women more likely to say that they found it difficult to balance their different responsibilities during this period, including childcare. And also, one kind of slightly cheeky question that we asked people was, would you go to, if there was a secret pub opened up on your street tomorrow and no one knew that you were going, would you go? And although the vast majority of people said no, very unlikely, men were still more likely to say yes. So it was interesting, I think, just to kind of dip our toes into that. But as I say, especially the kind of regional differences were dead interesting. And I think it's possibly something that we might rerun as we move into this next phase. Oh, and you asked me about relationship between journalists and the government. If I'm honest, I have had a kind of sense of general panic kind of hanging over the government's responses to things as we've been going along. And I think there has been a kind of more aggressive response, I think, to criticism, particularly over the last kind of couple of weeks or so, but it feels a little bit to me kind of born of thrashing around a little bit, but also possibly that some of the conservative backbenchers in areas where perhaps previously there weren't conservative backbenchers potentially have been starting to raise concerns about the government's approach to certain things, which is then kind of putting pressure on internally as well. And I think the tone of the government response has shifted, and their dealings with journalists over the last fortnight or so. Could it move back again? I don't know, but I think they're feeling the pressure, I think, is the kind of probably the key point.
Myself, that's great, Jen, and what you've said has really resonated, actually. Someone has, I think it's Jackie, who's messaged and saying, Jen is so right. Geographic, i.e. regional context, really matters. The problem is getting the data to help inform citizens. Using a single R number for the entire nation to make a decision on the reopening of schools, for example, is terrible. Local knowledge is imperative, but how do we make this happen? Is that something, Jennifer, that you would like to see? Would you like to see more regional data?
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. I think local authority level breakdowns were kind of relatively slow to start coming through, and once we started to get them, we could see that even in an area like Greater Manchester, which is relatively small, there are significant variations even between local authority and local authority. I think there's a debate around how useful the regional R number is, and I'm not a scientist, so I wouldn't want to kind of give a view on that, but I think there's some scientists that kind of said to me, well, look, the R number is useful when you've got big sample size and it's only as good as the data going into it, and we haven't got enough testing necessarily to be very accurate on that, and we are relatively small in our numbers when you're working out a regional one. But I think it's pretty clear that a region like the Northwest is several weeks behind London, so you do have a different situation in terms of case numbers. You probably have a different situation with prevalence in the community, and I think one thing I've really noticed, not only around the messaging and the narrative, where certainly in the early days it was very top level, national, is that's also been reflected in the data, but I think it's also been reflected in the government's general thinking, that it has been at times so command and control because it's almost been necessary for that response to just be, really tight grip, that some of the kind of bits of flexibility around the edges that you can get from giving local areas a bit more autonomy then gets lost. So a good example would be Manchester. We're a few weeks into the lockdown, and there were a lot of businesses and laboratories and expertise in Manchester, and we've got a big life sciences sector in Manchester, who were saying to the government, we can help. And I was kind of scratching my head going like, why are they not taking this up? And the best theory that seemed to come through was that the processes were so rigidly centralized that it didn't have the agility and the flexibility to kind of move and use that. And I think that's a kind of story that's come through quite a few times during this. It would be nice to think, and I think probably it will have to happen as we move into the next stage. There probably will have to be a little bit more flexibility in terms of how local areas choose to deal with things. And we're seeing that coming through now with school reopenings, where I think the government has kind of conceded the point that we are not going to have a national uniform picture when it comes to schools reopening.
Yeah, no, I completely, I totally agree with that. And there's quite an interesting kind of wee thread that's going on in the chat, and this is about the concept of, you know, women being a bit more worried about the future. And somebody has made a great point, and it's true. Are women pessimistic or are women realistic? Because, as you know, Deborah said, we have got some really bad times coming down the track. I mean, we have like the mother of all recessions, so maybe that is a good frame. Maybe it's not that, you know, we're all just depressed, not that I'm just depressed, but, you know, it's with, because we know the evidence of what is likely to come. And there's also there's a few really interesting points about, is this the case because men are more preconditioned to take risk, and women are more kind of socialized to be obedient and, you know, play by the rules and not break the rules and all that kind of thing. And somebody is making, again, a very important point, and this is a big caveat for all of this stuff. Of course, you cannot completely generalize in terms of an entire gender or sort of biological sex, and there's lots of other factors. Intersectionality also plays a really important part. Your ethnicity, your social, your economic, your social strata, your economics, whether you're a disabled, you know, there's so many different kind of strands to this. And one of the points that somebody has made as well, for people who are shielding, it's difficult, but, you know, if you're a disabled person shielding, people are not feeling like they have got a huge amount of support from the government. So I think that's a really important point. Yes, of course, these polls are slightly sort of generalized, and we do have to make that caveat. A lot of you are also kind of feeding in, particularly listening to Jen and Deborah, saying that a lot of you are upset with how the government have handled this. You're angry, you're frustrated, you sort of wish there was a bit more humility from the government. Sarah has very nicely said that she already feels better having tuned into this seminar tonight. We should have all had some wine, we would have felt even more better, basically, by the end of it. And I think Pamela also makes an important point, saying, look, I think what's coming through is there's a real lack of understanding of the gender dimension to the economy, which has not been recognised in terms of the value of jobs. You know, for example, teachers and teaching assistants, it was just sort of sprung on them without anybody really sort of having the courtesy to these jobs are skilled, these jobs need a lot of preparation, they are important work, you know, they need planning, all of that. We've seen it with the care sector. So some really interesting, important things coming up, and someone's saying these seminars are great and it's good to have a safe space to discuss these, you know, quite emotional issues, because we are talking about our fears, we're not talking about hopes, we're talking about our fears. And so, yeah, and thanks so much for all your comments. They're so useful. Esther's just said, I hate the way teachers are being shamed to work. I think that's really important. Now, Gemma, we're just going to come to you to give us a perspective from the work that, you know, you've been coordinating for Fawcett, and you know, talking us through some of the lived experiences that women are experiencing at the moment.
Yeah, I think just starting by picking up on the data that we've been hearing about, and I think there has been in the chat some kind of questions about, you know, how much can you trust data and trends. What's been remarkable about the last few weeks generally is that there's been so much research going on, and it's all showing a consistent pattern. Everyone tonight is finding it. I've looked at other sources for this. Women, everybody's worried about their finances. Women seem to be more worried. There's a lot of anxiety. Women are more anxious. And women are, you know, less impressed by the government's handling overall. And they're also, across every research piece I've seen, they're more worried about the lockdown ending and feeling comfortable in doing a range of activities. And we have been doing weekly diaries with women across the country who are really grateful that they're giving their time to us to fill those out. And they really show the variety of experiences, from people who, you know, have found themselves in a pattern where they have their kind of routine and they're settled and it's not perfect, but they can manage, versus those who are under a lot of stress and strain. And I think I'd just like to share a few of their experiences, because I think what it does really well is show some of the policy issues that haven't been tackled and addressed. And that is why some of these women are really facing such a difficult time. So one is around for example, income for children. So we have a single mother of 3 who's one of our diarists. She has very young children, and she's expected to go to the court for a divorce hearing shortly. She has no one to look after that children. There's no one to help her. She's also on universal credit and has to be paying out for school resources, you know, as printer, paper, pens, and all that is coming out of whatever the kind of very limited income she already has. And I think that's part of the policy at the moment, which is that we haven't seen any increase in child benefit, and that's one area that has really been lacking from the government. The other part is that we've talked about shielding, and I think the experience of people shielding has really been missed out from a lot of the discussion. If you heard the kind of Sunday night Boris Johnson announcement, it was a kind of well done over 70s who were shielding, that was it. But we know that people are shielding for all ages and for all reasons, and if you live with somebody who's shielding, you will also be shielding too. So it's affecting a much broader number of people than's being captured in the data. And you know, one woman said to us that how frustrating it is when people tell her that, you know, it's going to be over soon, just, you know, it's only temporary, because she says it's not for us, and she's right, and it's not coming through for them. And another example of where people are really struggling is for those shielding who also live with somebody with a disability that they're having to care for them for. So one of our diarists is a mother with 2 young children. Her daughter is disabled. She has no one to, her and her husband have to care all day long. They have no time. Their whole day is caring, looking after their other child and cleaning. That's basically it. And we asked, what's the one thing that would make a bit of a difference to you? And her answer was just to have like 10 minutes to sit down and watch TV, because she doesn't have any of it. She has no support, her carers aren't there. These people are being missed from the debate at the moment. They're just not being heard in the general view of this is lockdown in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. They're looking at a much longer lockdown, and everything that we do is a compromise. The government's decisions will mean that, you know, if you lock down earlier, those shielding will probably have to stay home later, but that is being missed for these women in the discussion. Another diarist who's a woman of colour is in a workplace that's closed at the moment, and she has told us that she's just been left with in charge of all the cooking and cleaning, looking after the kids, and she's really starting to resent it and feel a bit stressed. She's lost her kind of job, and now she's at home, and she's afraid. She's looking at what's happening in the NHS and care staff amongst BAME doctors, and the death rates, and she's scared, and she's worried that this has happened because they're afraid to speak up, and she says that resonates with her. She's been afraid to speak up, that she has to be this model person, and that they've been in the same position and now this has happened. And another kind of through the eyes of is one of the posters on the chat mentioned people who are living alone, and we have been heard. Actually, this was one of the questions that we posed this week, so we will write about it a bit more next week. But we have heard from people who are on their own, who, for example, freelancers whose work has dried up. They're not having that much day-to-day contact with someone. And she said to us, you know, she's had no physical contact for anyone for weeks, and what that feels like. And it is hard, and that is another area that has been missing. And I'm just going to go through one other area that has been missed, which is those with other medical conditions. So there are a lot of people who are awaiting cancer treatment, awaiting surgery, and they're just not being in touch anymore. And although it's not a medical condition, I'll just add on pregnant women to that as well, because there is high anxiety amongst pregnant women. It's coming through so much that they're nervous about the birth, they're nervous about afterwards, not having the support. There are women who have had postnatal depression with previous pregnancies, and they're so worried that it's going to happen again and there's going to be no one there to support us. So I think that what we're hearing from the diaries really illustrates that some of the challenges that we're seeing in the data, you know, that women are more nervous about daily life starting again. And I think part of the reason of that is that we haven't seen why the government has made the decisions it's made. They haven't tried to bring people with them or reassure them or show them the evidence. And that makes people think that the evidence isn't, you know, convincing enough to share. And I think that women really are so cautious about doing those activities, you know, the kind of day-to-day back to normal activities, that I think that they're crying out for that reassurance.
Mute myself. I'm not muted. Thank you so much for that. And I think the shielding stuff has really struck a chord with people. Sarah Bajaya says she's a BME disabled woman, she's shielding. This is a discussion that really is not being had. And I think that's really true. I have to say I we're absorbing news all the time. You don't really see this coming up as an issue. I think a lot of women are feeling really invisible at the moment in terms of their sort of thing. Gemma, I'm just going to come back to you because Marcia has raised this question a few times, and it's a slightly broader thing, but she's got a question about and maybe it's about making women's votes count more, but should we be changing how voting works? And actually, Deborah, I wouldn't mind you coming in on the back of this as well. Should the Fawcett Society be campaigning for proportional representation to try and change the entire political system and how we vote?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think that there's often a lot of support for changing the voting system because in the idea that it makes votes count. But unfortunately, I mean, this is my probably personal view rather than Fawcett view, but I think that whatever change of voting system you move to, there will be faults. So you could move to a more proportional representation one, and you may see more extremists taking seats in the Commons. There will always be some kind of issue and compromise and coalition government, as we've seen in recent years, where also there is the voters don't necessarily get a choice in what those compromises are. But the key thing is to get more women in politics. So what we've really missed is that women haven't been around that decision-making table. It's been so evident. We mentioned about women not doing the kind of daily press conferences. There's a kind of core of 5 men who are making all the decisions. And also, when you look at the list of experts who've been around the table, not only have they been missing women around the table, but there's been a lot of criticism too that they've been missing public health experts. So you've got a lot of modelers, but you haven't got a lot of people who think about what that actually means in practice for people's lives. And I also wonder how many people who made that announcement about schools going back had children in reception in year 1. Were they just thinking, well, we need to open up schools because women need to work? Or did they actually think, how could you possibly ask 5-year-old children to social distance? And yes, children will get snot on their teachers, and that is not their teacher's fault. That is just the way young children are. So I think that there just hasn't been enough diversity of thought in the decision making.
Definitely. Deborah, I'll come to you in a minute, Jennifer. Deborah, just if you could pick up on that, just a quick thing on proportional representation, and then, picking up, I want to actually come to all of you and ask this question about the role of women leadership or lack of, and what we also think about how other female leaders around the world have done compared to us.
So do you want me to start with the PR point?
Yeah, start with PR if you would, and then go into it.
So okay, just to put my cards on the table here, I'm somebody who is personally in favour of proportional representation. Right, I'd love to see it happen. However, I would say if you can't make the case against the backdrop of a hung parliament, and basically we couldn't, I find it almost impossible to see how you can make the case when you've had a government returned with a very healthy majority. So I would say that is not the place to focus energies right now, I'm afraid, and I say that with some regret. I would say I agree with everything that's been said. I think we need more women. Frankly, we need more ordinary people in politics. It's not just women, although great to see more women. I think that we need more people voting. We need more people being active. We need more people educating themselves. We need more people really understanding what's going on and making it their responsibility as a citizen to be across some of that. And people need to feel that that's something that they should be doing. One of the things, I am, however, a bit optimistic at the moment, because I do think, all my career, when I've been looking at voters, I've heard people say it's really hard to make the connection between what's happening there in Westminster or in my local council or whatever and what happens in my life. And I do think that this crisis changes that dynamic, because people can actually see the difference that politics can make to their lives in a really vivid way. And whether they like what the government's doing or whether they don't like what the government's doing, whether they think the opposition's doing a good job or not, they can actually see the difference. And I think that's an opportunity that we should really seize for the future, to try to sort of get better political engagement.
Yeah, I mean, this is a hugely challenging moment, but it could be a moment for opportunity and change as well. It could, you know, hopefully if we do this time learn some of the lessons, we will hopefully have a more compassionate view of the world. We will nourish our public services. We will reframe how we look. I mean, I hate that there's been a big debate this week. The phrase low skilled workers, you know, should be completely sort of banished in terms of, you know, it just tells you everything. And to the point earlier about how we see kind of, you know, the gendered economy. Jennifer, if I could just come to you on this thing about, you know, the lack of women involved, and, you know, do you think the government cares about that? Should they care about that with a whopping 80 seat majority? You know, they haven't pretended to be like, you know, the vanguard of feminism. Does it matter?
So I think what Gemma said about there being a lack of diversity of opinion among the people who are making decisions around it kind of struck a chord with me, because to come back to what I was saying at the beginning, that you can draw parallels between the gender issue, but also the regional issue and potentially ethnicity issue. That if you haven't got a kind of representative, I don't mean like literally perfectly representative, but if you have a group of people taking decisions and also facing up the message as well, who are all from a pretty similar kind of background with a similar outlook on life, same gender, same ethnicity, probably same level of income, etc., etc., etc. Well, then you are probably going to inevitably find that certain things kind of get deprioritized, get lost in the debate. And I'm not exempting the media from that either, by the way. But I think, I mean, a doctor said to me quite early on, you may have noticed that this virus is misogynistic, and I hadn't really thought about it that way, but they were pointing out to me that cervical screening was being cancelled very, very early on. You know, breast cancer screening was being cancelled. You've got this huge ticking time bomb around domestic violence, where charities, I spoke to one charity yesterday who said they'd had a 600% increase in calls, whereas Greater Manchester Police has had a 1% increase in calls. So where are those mostly, and they will mostly be women? Where are they? What's about to happen? What effect will that have had on their children? And I think, so to come back to it, does it matter? Yes, I do think that it matters. I'm not saying that having an extra woman at a press conference is going to magically solve all of those problems, but it is about a kind of plurality and a diversity around the table when these things are being thought through. And I think that goes for gender as much as it goes for all of these other concerns.
I think that's absolutely right. You know, as somebody in a previous life, I was a special advisor in government on gender issues. I worked for Harriet Harman. I helped draft the 2010 Equality Act, and I think, and I've spoken and written a lot about the lack of diversity in politics, even in progressive politics. And it's not just about the box ticking of here's a woman, here's a certain flavour of human being. It's about genuine diversity of life experience, of all life experience around the table. Because if you don't have that, you do get groupthink. That is how you get bad decisions that are poorly thought through. That's not just in politics, by the way. That's in every walk of life. That's in business. That's in everything as well. And I think Laura's actually made a really, really great point on this, Laura. Thanks for your comment. Laura's basically said it's not just about leadership, it's consultation. And she said there's, you could roll out a whole different way of making decisions, like citizens' juries around the country, really sort of getting into the fabric of communities. Like, we've talked about the shopping thing, for example, like really kind of try to get those sort of, because I think so many people in Westminster, particularly, the type of men we have in Westminster, are just not going to ever hear those stories. And again, the BME aspect is really important. Mo has messaged in saying she's really worried about doctors and nurses. She's from an Indian family with lots of doctors. Same here. I'm a very big disappointment, more to my family, that I'm not a doctor, obviously. But she said she's very, very worried about that and the whole issue of BME shielding, and also what's happening in our BME communities. We have a different way of, we have a different culture in terms of lots of people in, living together. And I think there's just who really is advising the government and making those points. I don't think it's going to be Priti Patel. Let's be quite honest about that. And Kully, I just want to come to you. in terms of the women's representation and the leadership thing, when you're doing your work in the field, and do you get a sense that people, that is something that people care about, or do they not really care about it?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. Just before lockdown, we'd done a big study for International Women's Day, and that's actually one of the questions we do ask. You know, to what extent does representation matter? And it does, and not just in politics and government, but also in business and media. So, you know, people sort of see, and, you know, where they see actually there's been most progress is things like education, but where there's been least progress is in government. But it's kind of interesting. So we, you know, in those studies, we have looked at some of the reasons where, you know, what is preventing a range of women and range of people coming. You know, if you just look at our sort of parliamentary process, and even now, there's sort of, you know, if people are going to go back into Parliament, you know, there's potentially a two-tier system for those who can, likely to be more men, those who, you know, aren't going to be the women with responsibility, you know, childcare responsibilities. But, you know, you just have to look at somehow some of women are treated in politics. You know, it's no surprise that the woman who receives most abuse, you know, is a black female MP, in terms of, you know, the kind of negative sort of media coverage that she gets compared to others. So I think we've got to look at some of the structural barriers that are preventing women, and, you know, that like you say, representation matters. Like, you know, if you see someone being treated badly, is that going to be an attractive option for you to, you know, is that something that you want to subject yourself to? So I think, you know, that does come out, and particularly in some of like the more qualitative research, that certainly does come to the fore.
And Mo's actually just picked up on that point as well. Mo has just messaged and saying, look, politics is such a toxic environment for BAME women particularly. You talk about Diane Abbott, who just gets the most kind of horrendous abuse, and you know, as a woman of colour in the media, I definitely feel it as well. In fact, I've had male white panelists that I've gone up against, or, you know, we do the paper reviews and things like that. And what's really interesting is they've had a little glimpse at my timeline, because sometimes they get tagged into all the abuse I get. And they have been like, wow, I have never seen anything like it. And I'm just used to it now. You know, you just get sort of used to it, but it's very, very difficult. Mo also says that she's a non-doctor disappointment to her parents as well. So solidarity, Mo, we can sort of
and me
and together on that. And just the final sort of another question that I just would like to sort of kind of throw out there really is this question, which, as we move from the public health crisis into the looming economic crisis, and, you know, so many of our participants have made the point saying, when are we going to get our politicians to understand how to look at the economy in a different way, in terms of a gendered way? How do we see infrastructure not just as road and rail, but childcare, and having school hours that match childcare, and, you know, caring for elderly people, and low pay for women, and all that kind of stuff? We keep, as Deborah said, you know, hopefully this is a moment to make that case, but how are we going to try and get that message through to our politicians? Because for many of us, we feel like we've been banging on about it forever. Deborah, if I could start with you on this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I do feel a little bit optimistic that this is a real chance to reset the economy. I hope it is. I mean, the economy will be reset. It will have to be reset. But the question is, will it be reset in a way that I guess a lot of the people who are on this call would like to see it reset? And I think in a way that's kind of up to us to make the point. But my feeling is that the kind of political sunshine is obviously where it always is. It's where the votes are. And I think that that's another reason for being optimistic, because, you know, again, in a Britianthinks poll recently, we found that 87% wanted to see things change in the way that we value and reward carers and healthcare workers. You know, that's big. That's a lot of people, and that isn't just women. That's, you know, that is a lot of people, voters, who want to see real change. So I think that's something that we should all be campaigning for with confidence.
Well, that will give us, I mean, I think you're right. I think all women's organisations actually should be really focusing on this, because there is a key moment of opportunity. Jennifer, what are your views on this? Do you think there's an opening with the current government, from what you've seen, to get some change on this?
So I think, broadly speaking, rebuilding the economy in a way that doesn't repeat all of the mistakes that have been made ad infinitum over however many decades, how far do you want to go back, I think that there's quite a lot of rhetoric around that at the moment, and that's already kind of developing as an argument from Labour and from mayors such as Andy Burnham. I think that there's a kind of, I think as Deborah says, that the political arithmetic of it means that it may not be, hope may not all be entirely lost on this. So it seems to me that some of the things that need addressing around, I guess, what nerds would call the foundational economy, so all of the stuff that you were just talking about that is kind of a little bit less the kind of macho, traditional economic stuff. There is a growing argument around that that says that really that needs to be valued a lot more. And I know that in Greater Manchester, there is a debate opening up now about, okay, well, we've got an economy here that has had at the heart of it a city Manchester's resurgent economy, but when you look at its economy and how it's going to be affected by coronavirus potentially in the medium to long term, we've got problems. You know, we've got the airport, the university, city centre, hospitality, all of those things are potentially going to be affected by what happens next in terms of people's behaviours, attitudes, continued social distancing and so on, and international travel. So then you have to start then looking at it differently, and you have to say, well, what are the things that perhaps that we kind of got wrong before? Do I think that that is going to be like a smooth process? No, not necessarily, but I also get the sense that this is a government that is looking for answers to some of these problems. They need to please those voters in some of those places where they won seats in December. And I mean, traditionally speaking, you get further with the government going to them with an answer to a problem than going to them with a problem. So I think if people lobbying and if politicians at local level have got ideas that could work from both an electoral point of view and make people's lives better, then I think actually now is the time to be going and presenting those ideas to government and you know, try and come out of this with something that is at least a positive.
So offer them a sort of, here's one we made earlier sort of solution.
Yeah, I mean, Greater Manchester's, without kind of making out Greater Manchester's perfect or anything, it's just that it's the area that I know really well. And I know that when they have had success getting stuff out of government, it tends to be because they go to them and say, right, you've got a problem, we've got a problem, here's our suggestion, rather than just go and give us a load of money, everything's shit. Like, that doesn't really get you very far. But yeah, you've got a government at the moment that does need to answer some of those electoral questions about how things get better for those voters. So
brilliant. Before I just come to our final two panelists, there's a poll, there's a quick poll thinking about the steps the government is taking to lift lockdown. Do you think it's moving much too fast, somewhat too fast, about right, somewhat too slowly, much too slowly? If you could vote in that would be very, very helpful for us. Gemma, just on that point, you know, what can Fawcett do, and what are some of the practical things that female campaigners and activists that are all logged into this call, what are the things we should and could be doing to try and make the case to our policymakers? Of course, it is the government, but there's also other political parties as well. Well, I think Gemma's on mute.
Thanks. Yeah, you asked the question as well about whether this is a moment for hope or a moment for concern in terms of the longer term. I think that the government have made some decisions around furlough that have saved jobs for the meantime. But I think it's women, the research has shown consistently, women were hardest hit by austerity and the recession in 2008. This time, they're far more likely again to be working in sectors that are most at risk. So there is a risk of recession and there is a risk that women are going to be hardest hit. There's also a weird position where we're at the point where care, which has been so undervalued for so long, is getting the attention and credit that it deserves. But at the same time, if there is a recession, it's likely to be social care costs and funding to local authorities that is going to be hit. So what we would say is that there really needs to be a push to keep that funding for social care, increase it, but definitely not to let it fall back, because people desperately need that care and those carers need to be paid properly. In fact, we have an event next Tuesday on this, on valuing care. We'll be publishing some research as well. But I think in terms of campaigners, I think there is that individuals can keep doing that push so that they don't see that fallback in their area, that those people who need care in their area, their local authority, speaking to their MP. But in terms of being involved in politics as well, we have launched with partners and Comic Relief a really great scheme to encourage people to get involved in politics and their local community at all levels. It's called Equal Power. There's more information on our website, but it really helped people to understand how to channel their frustration and anger. Anger came up a lot in the chat about feeling angry, to actually doing something, and that can take time, but it can happen.
And actually, Caroline has just messaged in with a brilliant suggestion, which is perhaps the Fawcett Society could help with template lobbying letters, which we could use to send to our MPs, which is a really, really good idea, because it does feel that we've got to get this campaign kind of going now, because as Jen, not Jen Williams, but another Jen, Jen Murray, who's just messaged in saying the government won't really care about all of this until the next general election. So I think we've got to kind of keep making noise. And as somebody who has worked for MPs for many, many, many years, if you do start making noise and causing a bit of trouble with post bags and email boxes and things like that, if they start to notice that more and more traffic is coming in to MPs' offices, they will start thinking about it. And actually, you know, there are some fantastic women in Parliament, women actually across the political spectrum who are working, very keen to work together on some of these issues. So it's really, really important to sort of encourage your MPs to sort of do this. I think Deborah might need to leave now. So and Jennifer, so I think we're just about to sort of wrap up. So we'll say goodbye to Deborah, and thank you so much, Deborah. Jen, are we saying goodbye to you as well?
Oh yeah,
goodbye, Deborah and Jen. Thank you.
I'll say one thing actually. Can I just challenge the one? But I do think that this government cares hugely about the polls. I think Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are bloody obsessed by them. Actually, that doesn't mean to say don't write letters and do all the other stuff. Do it. But I think they are really, really, really obsessed, and they're not waiting till the next election. If that, you know, if their vote share starts to go downhill, they will really care.
I agree with that, and I think that's partly what I was saying earlier on about their behaviour with the press over the last couple of weeks or so. That's what they're worried about.
Exactly.
Okay, so you guys, we'll just finish quickly. Just one point quickly. Someone said which bye bye Jen, bye bye Jen. What government are you talking about? Well, I think it's all our different legislative features. There's Westminster, there's Wales, there's Holyrood. I think local government is really important as well, because a lot of these decisions, you know, are incredibly local decisions as well. So I think it's a sort of, you know, it's quite a broad thing. It's definitely not just Westminster. That's very important. Kully, just final thing from you. Are you going to carry on doing this type of research in terms of tracking women on the coronavirus?
Yes, well, we're going to continue tracking a lot of the questions that we've asked. And I think the important thing, one of the things coming out today is all women aren't the same, and we are seeing generational differences. So we will continue to look at that, as well as, you know, if the data allows us to look at the regional differences, because I think there are some there. And I think that, just picking up very quickly on the point that Deborah and Jen made, you know, that politicians are obsessed with polls. One interesting thing that's coming out, obviously, the last election, we saw a massive age difference. So older people much more likely to vote Conservative, given the situation in care homes, what's happening in terms of, you know, older people being more affected. Will that change things? But also, you know, this has also shone a light on the importance people, you know, pay to the NHS. And given that they have been funding massive schemes, it will raise questions about how the state, you know, sort of helps recovery in many spheres, both infrastructure, climate change, but also, you know, kind of funding the NHS.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to all brilliant panelists. It was such an interesting discussion, and thank you so much for tuning in on this very warm summer evening, and for all your comments. They've been so helpful, like so many useful. I mean, in fact, the lady who mentioned, that was Caroline, about MPs' letters, Domino's just messaging, who works for an MP, saying great idea, this would really, really help us as well from the MP side of things. So I think this discussion has been so useful. It's just like sparked so many discussions. Please do consider, if you've enjoyed the conversation today, please do consider joining the Fawcett Society as a member, or even making just a one-off donation to the Fawcett Society, so that we can carry on doing this really important and very vital and necessary work. And there's a link on the chat, and we will send a follow-up email. And please join us next Tuesday with the Fawcett Society for 50 years of the Equal Pay Act at their event on the care sector. Such an important issue, and we have a long way to go on equal pay. So thank you all so much. I know we're all very anxious at the moment, and one of the things that has come in is that it's actually been a kind of a relief to a lot of people to know that they're not alone in their anxiety. It is not a sort of freakish, unique thing. I think we're all going through this. It's good to talk about it. It's good to know that what you're feeling is very, very common. It's a shared experience, and it's good to talk about this stuff to sort of know that you're not alone. So stay well, stay alert, whatever that means, and look after yourselves. And we look forward to seeing you in the next Fawcett Society event. Thanks very much. We're going to leave the meeting now. Thank you.